Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt, live inside the Beltway on Election Day. Make sure you get out and vote. 50 years ago, my next guest stormed an airplane, got shot for his efforts, saved a bunch of passengers, four Palestinian terrorists killed. But you probably better know him as the once and future Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu. Mr. Prime Minister, welcome to the Hugh Hewitt Show. Great to have you on.
Good to be with you. Very
I
good.
have
And
I,
with your audience as well.
I have greatly enjoyed Bibi, my story. Jonathan Karp sent it to me on Friday, and I've done nothing but read it and listen to it. And I enjoyed the fact that you recorded the end of the book, but not the beginning. So I got through your accent pretty good at the end there. Let's start with the beginning, though. And an argument among brothers on a tarmac about who is going to rush into an airplane. I've never read that before. That might be familiar to listeners in Israel, but it ain't familiar to Americans. That's kind of an extraordinary story.
Well, indeed it was. I could tell you that far from being just an extraordinary story, it was an extraordinary, in many ways, an unbelievable moment in my life. And it's one where my brother was pitted against me. We had 16 soldiers from our unit, dressed as mechanics, about to fix, in quotes, fix a hijacked plane. That was a ruse arranged by Defense Minister Dayan to overtake this hijacked plane that was landed near Tel Aviv. The terrorists demanded that we release 300 jailed terrorists, and if Israel didn't agree, they'd blow up the plane with all its passengers. Dayan seemed to acquiesce to their request, falsely, of course. But we had to fix the plane to allow it to fly with the released terrorists to a destination of the choice of the hijackers. We got on the plane. We were to get on the plane as mechanics, situate ourselves in front of these various entrances, and then storm on a prearranged signal, storm the plane and kill the terrorists and release the hostages. No one had ever done that before. So we were all ready to go. We had practiced, dressed up in mechanics, white mechanics overall, stuck the Beretta pistols in our boots. We couldn't use our Uzis and Kalashnikov assault rifles, which are our normal weapons, because they were too big to hide, and also because their firepower could have endangered the passengers. And now we're all ready to go. And my older brother, Jonathan, Yoni, who was senior to me in our unit, came to me and he said, well, I'm going too. And I said, you can't go. He said, why not? I said, well, because I'm already there. And you can't have two brothers in such close quarters because obviously one of us could, or even both of us could get killed. We were afraid the terrorists would blow up the plane with prearranged charges that they put on the aircraft. And then he said to me, well, then I'll go in your stead. And I said, you can't go in my place because these are my soldiers. And he said, so we'll both go. And I said, Yoni, what are you talking about? Think of father and mother. Think of what would happen if one of us got hurt or killed. And he said something to me that was unbelievable. He said, very slowly and very deliberately, he said, Bibi, my life is my own and my death is my own. And I saw that iron resolution that he had. And of course, I pushed him off as far as I could, but we had to go to the commander of the unit, and he sided with me. So my brother was left behind. Well,
My favorite part, and only a brother could do this, it's an amazing story with which to begin a book, but only a brother could stand over his wounded brother as Yoni stood over you because you took the bullet and say, Bibi, I told you not to go. I laughed out loud when I read that because only a brother could do that, right?
well, he didn't know when I was shot by friendly fire in the storming of the aircraft, and we killed two of the terrorists and captured two of the women terrorists. And liberated the plane. And tragically, one young woman, a young mother, was killed by the terrorists. But we were able to liberate everyone else. And I was the only military casualty. I got shot in the arm, And as I lay on the tarmac, I could see Yoni rushing to me, and he had a terrible look of distress on his face. And as he approached me, you could see the white splatter of blood as he stood over me on my sleeve. That's where I got shot, in my arm. And a huge grin spread over his face, and he said, "See, Bibi, I told you not to go."
Yeah. I am the youngest of three boys, Mr. Prime Minister, so I identify with Ito through this thing. But I am not a soldier, and I've never been a soldier. I think that's an amazing story. Mama told you not to go. Listen, there are many, many memorable portraits in here. Yoni is by far the most memorable. You wrote this in longhand during your 1 year in opposition. Did you set out to make this a testament to Yoni? Because that's what it is.
Well, I think it's interwoven with the story of my family and my brother, obviously, and my father was a great historian of the Jewish people, and also a great activist for Zionism in the 1930s and 1940s during the war, especially in America, where he met just about everyone, including General Eisenhower. But my story is woven with the story of the rise of Israel and the mission that informed my family and me to assure the security, prosperity, and permanence of the one and only Jewish state. But of course, the story of my own family, of my brother and my father, my mother and my brother too, looms large in this saga. So did I set out to write? Yes, I wanted, of course, to tell people, especially people outside the country who don't know the story of my brother. Obviously, I wanted to bring that to life because 4 years later, he commanded perhaps the most celebrated rescue mission of modern times, which is the rescue in Uganda, in Entebbe, Uganda, of another hijacked plane. See, this time the terrorists thought, well, we can't land a hijacked plane in Tel Aviv because we proved that we would liberate it. So they decided to take it to the heart of Africa, thousands of miles away, and surely Israel couldn't do anything there. Well, they were wrong.
They were very wrong.
Dead of night, my brother landed with the unit that I had served in. I was by then already a student in Cambridge, Massachusetts at MIT. And Yoni had become the commander of this unit, leading his men, stormed the old terminal in the Entebbe airport where the hostages were kept, liberated 103 Jewish hostages, killed the Ugandan troops, destroyed the Ugandan MiGs that could have given chase to the plane, and performed what Drew Middleton, who was a very respected commentator of the New York military analyst of the New York Times, said was an operation without precedent in military history. But Yoni died. He died there, leading his men. So obviously, it was perhaps the most tragic moment of my life. Not perhaps, for sure. Second only to the task of telling my parents, as I did, about the fall of their oldest son.
Yeah, that is actually the most moving part of the book, Mr. Prime Minister, when you drive 7 hours from Boston to Ithaca and your father lets out what you say is an animal cry. I've actually seen that by another father, and your mother screams, but you had to do it, and the recounting of that, I appreciate. It's really a fine book. I want to compliment you on weaving the history of Israel from its founding in 1948. I mean, you're born in 1949, but we get the 1956 war, we get the Six-Day War in 1967, the 1973 war when you fly back, and you find Yoni in an orchard. It's all pretty amazing, but you do effortlessly weave the story of Israel into Bibi, My Story. By the way, it's available at bbmystory.com if you want an autographed copy of Bibi, My Story. So I got to ask you, though, I began Bibi, My Story immediately after finishing Tom Cotton's book, Only the Strong. And Senator Cotton, like you, led men in combat. I'm beginning to wonder whether or not that is crucial for countries to put leaders into position who've actually had shots fired at them and who've had to kill enemies of the state. What difference does that make in leading a country to go from being the dispatch to being the dispatcher?
Well, it's a world of difference because when you're in these special units, you're hankering to go to take on any mission. You think you think you're a band of supermen, and in many ways, you are, but you're not, because the difference between success and tragedy is could be a few centimeters, as it was in the case with Yoni. He was hit and died, and yet you have that eagerness to carry out these life-saving missions, as do your men. But for me, the difference was that I had seen the loss of loved ones, not only my brother, but when I was 18, shortly after I got into the special unit, a close friend of mine actually died in my arms, died on the way to a hospital. And 30 years later, I came to visit his home. I never got to visit his home in the city of Beersheba in the south of Israel. And his mother opened the door for me, and she showed me his room, my friend's room. She left it exactly as it was 30 years earlier. So I always thought, when I dispatched men into combat, when I made that decision, I always thought of my mother and of his mother and the mothers of Israel. And I remembered what my brother told me when I went to officer school. He said to me, and he had been an experienced commander. He had been a veteran of many battles, an unbelievable, I would say, poet warrior, philosopher warrior. But he said to me, the difference between a good commander and a bad commander is that a bad commander squanders the life of his men, and a good commander accomplishes the mission with minimal or no casualties. And I always thought of that the life of our soldiers is so precious, and the horror and the anguish of the bereaved families is so deep, that I had to be a good commander and accomplish the mission, but do it with the best economy. That's a terrible word. The minimal loss of life that you can achieve. So I always thought that. And of course, when I didn't authorize missions that brave soldiers and brilliant soldiers worked so hard to prepare, and on occasion, not many, but on occasion, I didn't authorize it, they would be just as frustrated, and they probably thought,
you're right.
Who's this? What is this old fogey? I mean, how come he doesn't authorize it? So the unit that I served in was modeled on an Israeli commander unit that was operated in the 1950s. One of its commander was actually Ariel Sharon, who was a great general, later became Israel's prime minister. But it was also modeled on the British SAS, the Special Air Service, that was formed by a very eccentric and equally brilliant commander. His name was David Sterling, whom I actually met once in London. And David Sterling's motto was, "Who dares wins," and that was the motto in Hebrew that was put on the wall of the unit's dining room. So one time, when I had the many missions of the unit that I had authorized, the unit commander gave me a little souvenir from this extraordinary mission, and they said this. They wrote on this: "Who dares wins if the boss dares to authorize."
Now, throughout this, there are some harrowing moments. You almost drowned in the Suez Canal. You mentioned centimeters. If someone doesn't extend a hand, you're dead because you jumped in the water with, I don't know how many kilograms of weight on you, and you were sinking like a rock. Another time, you have to get a soldier off of his knees in the Golan Heights. In fact, the Golan Heights were hard on both you and your brothers, all of them. So it's a matter of inches in war. When you're making that decision to go or not go, and this is going to lead me to Iran, what is the ultimate calculation, Mr. Prime Minister?
I think the first thing is whether you can maintain a clear head in the midst of battle or in the midst of enormous duress. In the Suez firefight, we were at the time at war with Egypt. Happily, that's behind us. But we had a terrible war of attrition, and we were being attacked by the Egyptians who crossed the canal to our side. and were raiding our people, killing them wholesale. And the Army Command decided to send my unit to their side of the canal, and we successfully did that one night and ambushed an Egyptian military convoy. And this, by the way, not a pleasant experience to see people in agony and die. It's something that I never rejoiced in, put it this way. But of course, there was great rejoicing on our side. So they said, "Okay, we'll send you another time." And 48 hours passed between this successful raid and the next one. And as we got into these Zodiac rubber boats across the canal, as we approached close to the Egyptian side of the canal, the Egyptians had dug foxholes every 100 meters without our knowing it, and they opened just a horrific fire at us, which killed one of my friends on the boat right in front of us. And I thought that we'd be much safer. And if you want to imagine, just think of these movies that you see, like the landing in Normandy. So just imagine this horrific fire that is being fired at you, and you're like sitting ducks, literally sitting ducks in these rubber boats, 30, 40, 50 yards from the Egyptian position. And we began rolling our boats back. And I thought and said to my fellow soldiers on this boat, we'd be much safer in the water because the bullets, after they lose their trajectory. And so we all jumped into the water except the guys who stayed to steer the boat back. And I forgot that although I had a life vest, I had only half inflated it. In my hurry to jump into the water, I forgot that I was carrying a 40-pound pack, ammunition pack. I was a gunner with a machine gun. And of course, I left the machine gun in the boat, but the backpack was strapped very tightly, combat fashion, on my back. And as soon as I jumped into the water, I began sinking like a rock to the bowels of the Suez Canal. And I realized that I was going to drown. The boat, in the meantime, moved towards our side, and I tried desperately to reach back the surface. With my lungs were beginning to fill with water. I managed to reach the surface, drowned again, mustered all the strength that I had for one last kick for life. And at that point, you're overcome with tremendous, just on the verge of panic and suffocation, which is, it's a question: what is the worst death? Having experienced near death by drowning, I'd say that's pretty high on the list. But somehow I managed to muster enough strength to give one last kick, reach the surface. Not quite. My hand actually reached the surface, and somebody grabbed my hand and connected it to the rope on the rubber boat. They must have seen me, and they took the boat back, strapped me to the boat, pulled me into it, and that's how I survived that. So what was I thinking at the time? Life, how do I live? How do I overcome death? But that's when you were trying to save yourself. At other times, when you're a commander, as I was later, and you described on the Golan Heights, and it's actually on the Hermon Mountain, coming back from an operation in Syria, trying to save my men because we were caught in a blizzard. We were wet, we were exhausted, and we were suffering from hypothermia, and I knew that if we don't make it up that mountain, we all die. And one of the soldiers under my command, who happened to be the biggest guy there, must have weighed 230 pounds at least, and he just sat. He just sat in the snow. And I knew at that point that he's going to die. Now I'm frozen. My hands are frozen. My fingers are swollen to the size of cucumbers. I couldn't do anything with them. And I slapped the guy on the face. And I told him, get up. And he looked at me with these glazed eyes. He couldn't do anything. He just sat there. And I know he's going to die. I had to get him off. And I just had to have a clear head And remember, now this is anguish because it's very painful. Everything is very painful because you're freezing. Your extremities are freezing. Your feet are frozen. Your hands are frozen, and your mind is frozen. So I thought, how the hell, think. What are you going to do? You're going to let this guy die here? No. So I came up with an idea. And the idea was that we had what we call survival kits. The survival kit was nothing more than caramelized milk in a aluminum tube. So I said, okay, I'll give this guy a shot of glucose, and that might get him up. I got the this tube out of my pack. I unscrewed the top. It's a plastic covering, and now I was going to turn it around and puncture that aluminum seal at the top of these tubes. And unfortunately, because my hands were so swollen, I lost the cover, and it just sank into a meter of snow. So there's no way I could find it. And I said, "You mean to tell me?" I'm talking to myself. You're going to let this man die because you can't puncture this aluminum tube? And then I thought of a solution. I carried, as the commander, an Uzi submachine gun. The Uzi has a forward sight, which is a little triangle shaped. It's like a little pyramid, pointed pyramid, which is used for the gun sight. And I called one of the soldiers. I said, "Hold the weapon," and he held the weapon. And I took the tube and punctured it on this frontal sight. And sure enough, the aluminum seal was punctured. I took it, if you can imagine, like Popeye the Sailor when you give him the spinach. So I gave this soldier this caramelized milk, which luckily hadn't frozen. And sure enough, he shot up like
Popped right up.
Popeye.
Yeah, Mr.
Got right up. And we all made it back.
I want to turn to Iran. I want to turn to Iran and then come back into the book and go back and forth.
Just the answer to that. In combat or in moments of distress, you have to muster all your strength, and when you're a commander, all your clear-headedness above the fray, to think of what is it that must be done to win the day. It's that.
What must be done?
That extends obviously to other things as well.
This is why I'm so glad you won. Now, I'm an American. I'm not an Israeli, but I follow your... Michael Oren is a weekly guest on this show. I read everything about Israeli politics. Your win is enormous. It's significant. And you have one big decision ahead of you, and I don't expect you to tell me about that. But one of the things Senator Cotton quoted in his book was Sulla the Roman, who on his tomb has, "No friend has ever done me a favor, nor enemy an injury that I have not repaid in full." Is that a good guide for the leader of a country?
Well, it's a guide. I think I think the most important thing is the lesson that we, the Jewish people, learn, and that is that if somebody says that they're going to annihilate you, and I would say the world and the Jewish people in particular, oftentimes didn't take it seriously, and the most recently in the worst tragedy that befell any people, and that is, of course, the Holocaust. Hitler was broadcasting his plans, and people didn't take him seriously. And when he started targeting the Jews, people didn't understand that it would begin with the annihilation of the Jews, but it would continue, and almost did, with the annihilation of our civilization as we knew it. Well, we don't need that other lesson. So when Iran pledges daily to annihilate another 6 million Jews in Israel, to annihilate the Jewish state, I take them seriously.
There are two parts of the book that I hope the Iranian supreme leader reads and all of the people beneath him. The first is you're very careful in your criticism, but of Golda Meir, for whom you have enormous respect, she did not act preemptively in 1973, and you talk about what a disaster that almost led to. And then on page 189, you quote one of my favorite writers, Vladimir Bukovsky, who's To Build a Castle, My Life as a Dissenter, maybe one of the most influential books I've ever read. You quote him as saying, "Benjamin, please understand the Soviet regime," this is 1979, "please understand the Soviet regime is desperate. Everything is rotten inside. Nothing works. It's one big rotten core held together by the facade of invincibility provided by nuclear ICBMs parading in Red Square." He predicted the decline and collapse of the Soviet Union. Right, he was right on the mark. Do you predict the same thing for Iran, or will they need some help collapsing the government? Not the people, the government.
Look, it's a weak regime in many ways, and it's held together by a web of terror. The Basij, which is basically a system of stormtroopers who torment the Iranian population, which is showing enormous courage. Iranian men, Iranian women are showing incredible courage in standing up to this horrible regime that is subjugating them, depriving them of the most basic human rights. So they are weak. Their economy is weak. They need badly the lifting of sanctions, and they want to continue working on their nuclear program, which, if they got, would give them the ability to project ICBMs that they're working on, ballistic missiles that they're working on, to reach any city in the United States. Now, look, nuclear proliferation is horrible, but it makes a difference if Holland has nuclear weapons or if the Ayatollahs have nuclear weapons. The Ayatollahs whose mobs chant death to Israel, death to America. Remember, we're just a little Satan on their way, on their path. Ultimately, you're the great Satan. So I think you have to deprive them of that capability. And I made it my life's mission to prevent Iran from achieving its goal, to blocking them, preventing them from getting the weapons of mass death that would threaten not only my country, Israel, but the entire world, America first and foremost. And that requires a continual effort. It's not over. But I think one thing that has changed, to answer your question, is that the world now better understands the nature of this horrific regime and the catastrophe that would develop if the Ayatollahs got their hands on nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. So I think it's a common interest of the free world to prevent Iran from getting these weapons. Is the regime vulnerable? You bet it is. But that's something that maybe we'll discuss some other time.
Well, President Biden seems intent on another bad deal. You came to the Congress of the United States in what was a most memorable speech, and I think it really did clarify for Americans how bad the JCPOA is. If new Speaker McCarthy invites you to break the record that you hold right now with Winston Churchill and address the Congress again, will you accept?
Well, I don't know. I haven't had time to think about it because I was too busy winning an election, and now I'm still busy forming a government, which is a lot of fun. Believe me, elections are fun, sort of.
I'm looking at the Times of Israel, a picture of you meeting with your conservative coalition members. It doesn't look like fun, but let's go back to the book. I want to talk about your father. Maybe people in Israel know about Benzion. I had no idea your father was a scholar of the first degree, that he wrote The Origins of the Inquisition in the 15th century, that he named your brother for Colonel John Henry Patterson. Your father must have been amazing, but most of all, he knew Jabotinsky. I had no idea. It's like everybody in Israel knows everybody else in Israel, but that's really quite a... Do most people in Israel know that?
Well, they do now, given the sales of the book, which is selling in the last 40 years more than any other book. It's now competing, believe it or not, with Harry Potter. So I'm glad people find it of interest. And I think they can find in it something else, not only the story of Israel and my own dealings with most of the leaders of the world, but also I think they'd find in it what I call a life of purpose. And I think that's the only life worth living, a life of purpose. And then, so if you seek a life of purpose, you may glean some insights from reading this book. My purpose was defined by my grandfather, who believed that the salvation of the Jewish people who were scattered in Europe defenseless would only come if the Jews returned to their ancestral homeland, the land of Israel, and built their own state. My father, who translated that understanding into a concrete political program, and my brother, who gave his life for it. And I've given my adult life for that purpose, first as a soldier and then as a diplomat, and later as the longest-serving Prime Minister of Israel. I guess it will be even longer now, given the election results.
But, yeah, Mr. Prime Minister, I got to ask, when you keep winning and you keep coming back, you make Salisbury in Great Britain and Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, you're giving them a run for their money. This might be your last 4 year term. I don't know if you're going to retire or not. Do you enter into it with a different sense of urgency and with a different, I don't want to use the word ruthlessness, but clarity about who you need in your government and who you don't need in your government?
Yes, but that's really mechanics of politics. The real question is, do you have set goals? And for me, the goals that I set for myself early on was to realize that basically only the strong survive. The weak are devoured, and I think the history of the world, including the modern times, has shown how important that the strength is. In fact, if you look at the history of the 20th century, our great misfortune was that in the first half of the 20th century, the U.S., the United States of America, was not the dominant power in the world, and we paid dearly with 6 million, a third of our people lost in the Holocaust. And there was no one to lead the world against the rise of Hitlerism, which my father, as a 23-year-old, in 1933 wrote, will bring an impending Holocaust. And that's what he said, an impending Holocaust.
It's spooky. It's actually spooky how right he was. Mr. Prime Minister, there are portraits in this book. Again, it's Bibi, My Story. If you want an autograph copy, go to bbmystory.com or go buy it at Amazon. You have portraits of a lot of American presidents, and my audience will want to know about this. First of all, you have a jovial rivalry with Bill Clinton. He tried to beat you when you first won the prime ministership, and then he called you up and admitted that he didn't, and let's work together. That's a different relationship than with President Obama. I'm still stunned that the President of the United States told the Prime Minister of Israel in the Roosevelt Room, where I've spent some time, I have an assignment for you. I can't even, I apologize on behalf of the president for that. I don't know how you stayed in your chair.
Well, look, I obviously had my differences with President Obama, as I had also with President Clinton. I mean, I think there were two main differences. The first was that they were convinced that if we have peace with the Palestinians, that would open the gateway to peace with the Arab states and would pacify the entire Middle East. I thought this was wrong for two reasons. One, the Middle East was fraught with so many conflicts, Arab against Arab, Shiites against Sunnis, non-Arabs against Arabs, you name it. And we had one particular section in it which didn't, you could remove Israel, you could put Belgium here, it wouldn't make any difference. I mean, the enmity to the West would continue from the radical forces that inhabit this region. And God knows we've seen the ISIS of the world, we've seen Iran, we've seen so many others. So that was, I think, a misunderstanding that I hope may have corrected itself over time. But the second thing was that the assumption that we could have peace with Palestinians and that would open the gateway to peace with the wider Arab world. Remember, the Palestinians are 1 to 2% of the entire Arab world. And that the problem of going through that corridor was that the corridor was blocked because the Palestinians, under their continuing leadership, don't want peace with Israel. They want a peace without Israel. They don't want a state next to Israel. They want a state instead of Israel. So if you keep waiting for them, they would oppose any peace treaty that we would have with any Arab state. And indeed, for the last quarter of a century, until the Abraham Accords, we had no peace treaty with any Arab state because people kept saying, you got to have first peace with the Palestinians. I said that we have to put aside the Palestinian veto, reach out to the Arab states, and after we developed Israel's strength, the rise of Israel, created by the Iron Triangle of Peace, as I call it, economic power by shifting to free markets, turning Israel from a semi-socialist to a free market economy, augmenting our military and our intelligence capabilities, thereby fusing the two to get enormous diplomatic leverage with the countries of the world. I thought that would open up the path for peace with Arab states. And indeed, that's exactly what we did in the Abraham Accords when we made peace with 4 Arab states, with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and the Sudan. And I believe that more will come. So that's truly peace through strength.
I have heard, Mr. Prime Minister, about the Abraham Accords that there was an informal gathering at the Cafe Milano where you happened to wander into dinner, not happened to, but intentionally went into a dinner when Ambassador Taiba was meeting with a bunch of Americans. I guess the path to the Abraham Accords took a long time and a lot of delicate diplomacy.
It did indeed, and it began actually with in many ways, with my speech in Congress in 2015.
Yes.
Before the joint session of Congress. As I was speaking there, we got messages in real time. Our delegation got messages from Gulf leaders who said, "We cannot believe what your prime minister is doing. That he's basically standing up to the United States and to the president of the United States, by the way, whom I respected but disagreed with fundamentally." I think the principal difference was that President Obama believed that peace will produce power, and I thought that power produces peace, and that the only way that you could get to peace is by being powerful. The only way that you maintain peace, especially in an undemocratic environment, is by being continually strong. So obviously, I went to Congress not in a haphazard way. I thought about it very hard because America, under any president, is our indispensable ally. It's an indispensable alliance, which I value. And the arguments we have I call it like the arguments in the family. And we say in Hebrew, in Yiddish, we say in the mishpocha, in the family. But in this case, the policy of making this very dangerous Iran deal, I thought would endanger the existence of my country. So I really had no choice. When I went and spoke against the Iran deal in the Congress, that was the beginning of direct contacts, as opposed to Mossad contacts with many Arab countries. But the direct contact that I had with Arab leaders, we had met secretly. And then I was very happy that President Trump ditched this plan, left the JCPOA, this Iran nuclear deal, and slapped sanctions back on Iran. That eventually led to the Abraham Accords. But the beginning was, in fact, the rise of Israeli power against the rise of Iranian power and the willingness of Israel under my leadership to challenge Iranian power. They saw Israel now, they shifted their view of Israel not as their enemy, but as their indispensable ally against the Iranian regime that threatened them as well. That laid the foundation for the Abraham Accords. It took a while until I persuaded the President Trump and his team that is where we should go. But once they were there and on board, we completed these agreements in a very rapid succession.
There is a lot of inside baseball in Bibi, my story, including I like the visit to Ethiopia, 3,000 years overdue. But I want to ask you about Putin and Xi. You had some secret meetings with Putin. You needed to deconflict the airspace over Syria because you're not going to let Iran get a base there. He's turned out just to be a killer and a war criminal, Mr. Prime Minister. I know you can't say that. I can say that. What are you going to do about Russia this time around? Because since you left and now you're coming back, he's invaded a country and he's committing war crimes. What are you going to do about him?
Well, it's something that I'm going to look into as soon as I get into office. I have to be briefed, understand exactly what the parameters are. The issue with Russia is obviously a complicated one because we share the airspace in Syria, and I committed as Prime Minister to prevent Iran from establishing another Lebanon, another Hezbollah front along in Syria, actually, which is adjacent to Lebanon and borders our northern border. They wanted to bring an army of 80,000 Shiite militia, put in very dangerous weapons there that would endanger Israel. So I embarked on a policy of continually hitting Iranian targets and Iranian military emplacements in Syria. And for that, we needed, obviously, to have the freedom of the skies. Now, remember that our pilots are flying literally neck and neck next to Russian pilots. And I remember a few decades earlier when I was a soldier, Israeli fighters, Israeli pilots were shooting down Russian pilots, and Russian anti-aircraft batteries were shooting down Israeli planes. And the last thing I'd want, is a renewal of that. So I I took pains to make sure that we don't have that conflict, and so far it's been successful. On the other hand, we also see what is happening in other theaters and other arenas, specifically Ukraine, and I'm going to study exactly where we stand and make my decision and what we are going to do. And that's something I leave for as soon as I form the government. I'll be able to look into it very carefully and judiciously and responsibly.
Now, I'd like to ask you about politics in Israel. The most moving part of this book is Shimon Peres's eulogy of your brother, which I would recommend to everyone. I mean, really, you stop and you're just amazed at what she. And he's a rival of yours, but you don't have any animus towards him. Lieberman deserted you in 2015. What do you feel? Would you rather deal with someone who's been against you all the time, or would you rather try and bring Lieberman back into the fold? Which is easier, to deal with a long time, an open opponent, or someone who turns around and stabs you in the back?
Well, I'm sure that never happens in American politics, right? Look, the nature of politics is that it makes strange bedfellows, and it makes also strange dining table partners. It's a peculiar profession, but you have to keep your eye on the goal. And the goal is that you're there for a mission. At least I am. I mean, power by itself is boring. It's totally uninteresting. Power for what? Power for what? For personal aggrandizement? For what? For nothing. I always viewed power, political power, as serving a larger purpose, and the larger purpose is how to make my country the one and only Jewish state, the state of the Jewish people who suffered so much and suffered as no other people have in history, finally have their independence in a strong, independent state in our ancestral homeland. And so I had to really devote my life and the politics that were involved into transforming Israel, which was really a semi-socialist state with a GDP per capita that trailed just about every European country. We were $17,000 per capita. And after the economic transformation of Israel to free market lines, Israel now has got a GDP per capita of $53,000. And that's an incredibly short time.
It's really remarkable. And your time as finance minister, which is chronicled in Bibi My Life, is I think, very useful for anyone entering into power. I hope Rishi Sunak reads it, actually, about how to free up the British economy. But I want to go back to Lieberman. Would you invite him back into the coalition if he'd come?
I'm not barring anyone who shares the guidelines of the government, so I'm not specifically talking about anyone. But first I said I'd build a coalition, as I said, and that's what I'm going to do, of like-minded parties who went with me. They were there through thick and thin. The assumption was that the parties beginning with Likud and to the right of Likud would somewhat crumble. That the Likud people would rebel against me. That was the assumption of this hodgepodge coalition that took over the country, led by fake right parties that pledged that they would never go with, not merely with left-leaning parties, but with the Muslim Brotherhood. They actually did a coalition with the Muslim Brotherhood, or opposed to the very existence of the state. And so they basically gypped the voters. That's how they got into power. But the assumption was that we would crumble. What happened was we didn't crumble. They crumbled. So my commitment, both on a moral basis and a political basis, is to build a coalition with these like-minded parties, strong, stable government, which we can now do because we have the majority, sufficiently large majority to do. And first of all, get Israel out of this absurd roller coaster of having elections every year, sometimes twice a year. That's finished. So now we're going to form a stable right-wing government for the next 4 years. And as far as anybody adding to it, well, we'll see. But that's the first thing I'm going to do. I'm not going to break up this bond that proved so loyal and so effective in bringing down this very dangerous government that we just brought down.
Well, I'm not going to tell everyone that this is the key to the book, but I was surprised to find Montesquieu in there and the need to rebalance the three branches of Israeli society. And I always care about the courts, Mr. Prime Minister. Are you going to reform? The Israeli Supreme Court has got the biggest overreach of any Supreme Court in the free world. And I don't know that anyone can argue with me on that point. Are you going to do judicial review reform?
Yes, carefully and responsibly, because the idea is not to trample the judiciary, because it's one of the three branches of government. You talk about Montesquieu. Actually, it's John Locke, if you want the origins of the idea of modern democracy is the idea of checks and balances, which were ultimately translated in their purest form in the American Revolution and the establishment of the United States. You have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and of course the judiciary. In our case, I think it got somewhat out of balance, and there's a need to restore balance, but not a need to destroy, as some people think, one of these nodes of the triangle. That it's really the three in balance with checks and balances that provide, I think, the assurance of democracy. I gleaned a great deal of insight from my years as a high school student in the United States, and later as a student at MIT, and living in America, understanding how democracy works. By the way, it's always messy. It's always very messy. It's always very sometimes turbulent, but it's based on this assumption of the assurance of both individual rights, but also the balance between and the rights of the choice, majority choice, but also the balance between the three branches of government. And that's one thing that I'm committed to, and God willing, we'll also be able to achieve in a responsible way.
My last two questions, Mr. Prime Minister. One has to do with the media. Do you think you have a tougher time with the Israeli media, or does Donald Trump have a tougher time with the American media?
Well, listen, I don't want to compare myself to any other country, but I'd say that Israeli media was, until very recently, almost uniformly against me. I think what changed that is, first of all, the emergence of the social media. Israel was, people were getting their opinions and their news from three television stations that were incredibly hostile to me, to my party, to me, because I represented a philosophy and a big segment of the public that they thought should not really have the voice in the public discourse, and therefore ultimately in the voting booth, because that affected, obviously, not by depriving people the right to vote, but depriving people the right to know, the right to think, or the right to differ in the public airwaves and the media airwaves. So that began to change, I'd say, with the rise of the social network. And mind you, there are problems of polarization and all the other things that you know about in the social network. But that, I think, pales compared to the idea that people will not have an outlet. So you have to have this ability, as well as also the rise of some, for the moment, rising social channel. And imagine the United States without Fox or the Wall Street Journal or alternative media or talk radio. That was Israel until a few years ago, and that's beginning to change. And the idea is you don't want to monopolize it. You don't want to wipe out the opposing press, the press of the left. You just want to have a marketplace of ideas. I'm a big idea in free markets. And the free market of ideas is one of the essential components of a democracy, which I firmly believe in, both in the balance between the institutions of democracy, but also in this other institution, which is absolutely important. And the way, I've always explained this to my followers. They say, no, we got to, take over the media. And that's something that I'm falsely accused of. And I said, no, that's not what we need. We just need to ensure pluralism, and different voices. Let the people decide. That's what democracy is all about. Let the people decide. Let informed electorate decide.
That's what Churchill always said. Trust the people. And I know you're a Churchill student. You mentioned the only person who's mentioned more than your wife in this book, maybe Will Durant. You also read a lot about Western civilization. I mean, I've never read Will Durant in a book so often as I have as in Bibi, my story, but I want to finish on Sarah. You probably know you have no greater defender than in the United States than Katie Pavlik. I was at dinner with Katie Pavlik during one of the endless elections that Israel went through, and she gave me a lecture on the political smarts of Sarah Netanyahu. And then you read about it in the book. She's the one that encourages small dinners, not large dinners. Is she looking forward to these 4 years, or is she tired of this and doing it out of duty?
Out of duty for sure, out of a shared sense of mission. Sarah is a lioness. She's a lioness. She's been by mainstays. She's been by supporters. She has incredible courage. She's been vilified by false lies, and as I think the spouse of no leader has ever been vilified for so many years, and yet her spirit never failed, her wisdom never faltered, and you know what? One of the things that I'm so happy that has happened is that an enormous number of people in Israel gradually came to understand Sarah's humanity, her compassion, her wisdom, and you know what they now say in the social media. I mean, it runs like it's just gone viral. After time and again, Sarah's predictions and her advice turned out to be right. They say Sarah was right. Sarah was right all along. And let me tell you, I was right in choosing her as my wife.
Yeah, it's an amazing portrait of her. I'm going to close with one question that's obscure, because you only throw in one reference to Shlomo Israeli, the unit's famed logistics chief, and it's sitting there on page 79. So what's the deal with Shlomo Israeli? Is he going to yell at you because you wrecked a car on the way back from a successful mission?
Well, I don't think he's around anymore, unfortunately, to do that. But we were coming back from another mission. There are many missions that I described. By the way, there are many missions, clandestine missions, many more that I don't describe. And in fact, there's an author's note that says that many missions, including secret diplomatic missions Mossad missions that I can't articulate. I described one. I mean, the pilfering by Mossad agents of the Iran secret atomic archive in the heart of Tehran. Did you see the movie Argo?
Oh, I love your comment. This will make Argo look like a cartoon. It's truly. I can't wait to get the real story on that.
Well, they got out of Tehran with a half a ton of secret documents that the Iranians kept for years in a secret archive. We found it in a hidden, dilapidated warehouse in the suburb of Tehran. They pilfered it. The Iranians gave chase with thousands of police and special agents looking for them, and they got out and brought it back to Israel, and I shared it with the world. I shared it with President Trump, and it showed that Iran lied consistently about its intention to, as late as 20 years ago, as early as 20 years ago, to build 5 Hiroshima nuclear bombs. So when they said, "Oh, there's a fatwa against nuclear weapons," that's hogwash, and they've gone further since, and I'm committed to stopping them. But I think that of the many missions that I couldn't describe, the one that I did was that we had come back from the snows of Syria and of Mount Hermon, the mountain range, 3,000 meters high, and we came back, and my deputy in this mission, which I commanded, was a man who had lived in a nearby kibbutz, and he said, why don't we go to my kibbutz and we'll sleep there instead of driving back to the unit? And I said, well, sure, it's okay. He said, sure, I'll drive. And he, in the middle of this drive, I dozed off and I woke up in midair because he hit the curb and we're flying in the air. And how many times do I meet death? Very, very often, as you can see in this book.
Yes.
And as we're in the air, I said, "Oh God, not again!" And we land in a mud embankment. And the first thing that this officer said was, "God damn it! Shlomo Israeli, the logistics sergeant, he's really gonna get at me." And I said, "Yora," that was the name of this officer. "Yora, just be glad that we're alive."
You know, Mr. Prime Minister, you used up about 7 of your 9 lives in this book. So be safe and be successful. Congratulations on winning, and congratulations on Bibi, My Story in American bookstores now. And thank you for an hour of your time. You've been very generous. It's a terrific book. I can't believe you wrote it in hand, and that someone had to type it. And to whoever that was, my thanks as well, because that can't be easy.
Mine too. Almost got divorced from that.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Come back again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.